But today's topic is titled "The Self Cannot Be Helped." It was an idea that came to me, a direct response to the conflicting experiences we can have in terms of our practice, where we are encouraged to know our innermost self, our innermost essence. But the challenge is, what self are we actually talking about? And it can get very muddled depending on who's delivering, who's talking about it, and what's being said. And in our practice there, in our meditation practice towards the end, there was a space just to reflect on how we connect with our own sense of self. But this is a very personal, intimate, internal process. So we're left wondering and sometimes doubting what it is that we're actually experiencing and where this self starts and stops. Now, as yoga practitioners, we are familiar with the core tenet of yoga practice, which is that we realize the self. And so yoga offers an explanation and an understanding of the self, which is quite specific. So we have this understanding of the self from its ordinary perspective, the ordinary sense of self, and then what we would refer to within our yogic discipline as the non-dual self. And fundamentally, what differentiates them is the fact that the ordinary sense of self is reliant on identification, relationships, associations, and the non-dual self is not. Now, yoga, drawing from Samkhya and Advaita Vedanta, in these two philosophical systems, we can get a greater sense of what is being pointed at when we're talking about the self to be realized within yoga. From a Sankhya point of view, there is the figures of Purusha and Prakriti. And so Purusha is the self, the innermost self, the core self. And it's often spoken about as pure conscious awareness. So Purusha is the pure conscious awareness which is present beyond Prakriti, which is the everything encompassed within manifested creation, manifested reality. So Samkhya differentiates. There's two core experiences. One is everything which is manifest, and the other is that which is just observing, seeing, witnessing, conscious and aware. And we are, within the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, guided to learn how to move through a process where we are able to let go of our association with Prakriti, with the manifested reality, and the identifications which are at the foundation of the establishing of an ordinary self. The different variables of the expressions within the world around us, from the most gross physical expressions to the more subtle in terms of our sensations and bodily experiences, and then to the extremely subtle in terms of our thought processes. That we are being guided through a process where we can disengage with that progressively so that we can then come to a point of recognition where we can realize that there's a capacity to observe and witness all of those identifications. And when the identifications stop, that the awareness stands alone. And there's an experience of being conscious of this awareness, standing alone. And that's what's offered to us within Samkhya. And so the self, which is being spoken about, is often written with a capital S, just to highlight the difference between it and the ordinary self. Now, Advaita Vedanta goes a step further in that it doesn't differentiate between Prakriti and Purusha in the same way. Advaita Vedanta would call the true self, the Atman, to be that which is on par with Brahman, which is the one unifying eternal reality. And so the Atman and the Brahman are equal. And that any notion of there being anything else outside of that is illusory. It's a misperception. Now, in terms of the self, then, the self with a capital S within Advaita Vedanta is the core, groundless ground of being, as in, it's the shapeless, undefined canvas from which everything is expressing. Which means then that when we talk about the self within Advaita Vedanta, we're talking about the very underlying foundation of any reality which might come into being. And we can use the term Atman or Brahman. They are equal. So the notion of an ordinary self is a misperception. It's an illusory, fictitious notion. And that reality, which gives the sense of this ordinary self, all of it is illusory, because it's all transient, it's all moving, it's all in a state of flux. And so nothing can actually be pinned down and anchored down as being something substantial, something which is in itself real. It's a continuous process which has no substance of itself, which is just born out of consciousness. And so to talk about a self in this way as being some fixed character is, within Advaita Vedanta, illusory. So the difference, I suppose, just to clarify with Samkhya philosophy, is that the ordinary self is given some credit because Prakriti isn't disregarded. It's given some significance. Whereas Advaita Vedanta doesn't give as much credit or appreciation, perhaps, to that aspect of our lived experience. Now, in the modern world, these terms, which we're familiar with through yoga, are often used within the self-help industry, where they'll talk about actualizing your full potential, actualizing the potential of the self, realizing the potential of the self. And so they use the term the self as well. And you can see it in the coaching industry, life coaching, where there's a push towards being able to get to that innermost essence, or getting to know who you truly are and what you're truly about and what your purpose is and what you're here to do and what you're here for. And it also stems into therapies, even some psychotherapies, positive psychology and other types of therapies, where there's a kind of an onus on being able to disregard everything which is preventing you from knowing who you truly are. But when this happens, then it puts us face to face with the question of, well, what self are we talking about? In these different modalities, when they use languages which is very similar and very familiar to us, what are they talking about? Because within these different modalities, there's an emphasis on perfecting how we are experiencing ourselves, that we can refine and upgrade how we express in the world, so that, when we go about engaging in life, that we make the right decisions all the time, that we do X, Y, and Z in such a way that it leads to the most favorable results all the time, that we get things right all the time. And so this then plants a seed for us to be perpetually striving towards some state of experiencing ourselves which is perfect. So we're drawn and asked as practitioners within this tradition, what does this onus which has been placed on achieving a sense of self, as a way of experiencing ourselves which is more efficient, more effective, more on the ball, a kind of a sense of ourselves as being something which we can be less critical of, which is almost at a point of culminating into some kind of character which everybody will love, and there's no imperfections. So we're asked to look at this because it relates back to the sense of self, and which self we're actually talking about. Is it the self of the Prakriti or the self of Purusha? Because the self of Purusha cannot be perfected. The self of Purusha is in and of itself already perfect. It's already in a state which is unchangeable. It's fixed. It's the underlying foundational source of consciousness. So there's nothing to be done with it. But the way we're talking about the self in terms of the things that we need to do and should be doing in order to arrive at an expression of our innermost self, our true self, this can start to play on how we perceive even what is being offered within the teachings of yoga. And this then pushes us to strive for this state of perfection. But the question then we're led to ask is, what for? Who is it really benefiting? Now we know that within our world there's a certain emphasis on being able to sell a product, to being able to offer something to the masses, which is going to be of benefit to them, or at least seem like it's of benefit to them, because there's a feedback, there's a payoff, which is of benefit to those selling it. But if we're constantly striving to arrive at a state of perfected beingness. And this beingness that we're aiming to arrive at is ever elusive because it's not actually possible. Well, that sets it up for a perfect marketing campaign, and a product which is ever going to be sought after. A product that isn't actually able to give us what we want. So it's important for us as practitioners to see and to reflect on what we mean by self. And anything that we engage in terms of self-development or self-help, regardless of the texts we're reading or the talks we're listening to or whatever it is that we're engaging with, we have to be alert to this. Because nobody's going to use the term ego for the self in these within the industry, because that wouldn't sell as well. But quite often what's been spoken about is the ego. The self, the ordinary self, is fundamentally the ego. Now, what happens when we engage in these different talks, or when we go about gaining more information, is that we can start having a list of things that we have to do so as to move towards this experience of the self which is being talked about. You know, that if we look at the well-being industry at present, there's an emphasis on us ensuring that in our day-to-day living that we go to bed at the right time, that we sleep the right amount of hours, that we, you know, it's better to wake up in the morning, early morning, because then you're able to get more done. That you exercise enough, exercise sufficiently, that you eat the right foods, but you eat the right amount of protein, that you balance out your nutrients in different ways. Maybe you need supplements, that you're going to have to ensure that you fit in a certain amount of downtime, and maybe you need to focus in on a hobby, and then you need to develop a hobby, but don't just do that, you need to perfect it. And maybe you know, there's a whole emphasis on relaxing, but in a way which is not really relaxing. And all of this is even before we talk about the very fact that most people work 8 hours where they are expected to be productive and giving to whatever place of work that they are loyal to. So coming home from work in the evening, and then you may be a parent with kids, you've got demands and you've got duties and you've got responsibilities. So this extra demand that is coming through in the industry, which is asking us to be more effective and efficient in how we're living, so as to ensure that we're moving towards that perfected sense of self, perfected us, perfected you, perfected me. It has all the hallmarks of us being an object to be sculpted and molded and perfected to serve a purpose, to be able to give back. But the question then is, for who? Who are we this object to or for? Now, yoga is not talking about us as being an object. The self, the Purusha, that is the true subject, you know, where everything in Prakriti becomes the object. And so the relationship that we have with manifested reality is one of objectiveness, where we can see it objectively. But it's not pushing us towards perfecting the objects of Prakriti, because it has a recognition and an understanding and an appreciation that Prakriti in and of itself is imperfect. It's dual, there's polarity, because that's the tension that allows for creation to unfold. And so any attempt to perfect it is going to be one that's ongoing and infinite, because that's the very nature of nature, manifested nature. So this idea of treating us or seeing ourselves as an object which can be worked on is, it parallels to seeing ourselves as some kind of machine. And it undermines what we're really focusing on, which is our capacity to be aware and to see through it all. This ordinary self that compares to the inner self. This ordinary self is just like everything else in nature, shifting, moving. It can't be pinned down or anchored down. It keeps on changing. And we'll know this in simple ways, which you've probably heard before, that our identifications that we have now in our life, in terms of, it could be our interpersonal relationships, it could be the things that we like to do in our free time, it could be the types of foods we eat. All the identifications that we've got going on right now are very different to what we had going on maybe 20 years ago, or 40 years ago, or however long it might be. So there's a continuous shifting that takes place. And this even happens on a day-to-day level, where the way you're focusing your attention now and what you're identifying with that gives you a sense of who you are today could be quite different to what it was yesterday. And there's a capacity for us to see that there's this continuous movement taking place, and being able to define ourselves, this ordinary sense of self, in any one fixed way is an impossible task. But that's the notion that is very idyllic for us, to be able to kind of fix down some sense of who this ordinary self is. So it keeps on shifting. And because it keeps on shifting, it's always fragmented. There's always something out of place or missing or lacking, because we can give our attention to so many things, but there's so many other things that we're not able to give our attention to. We can be able to define ourselves in terms of the job we have and maybe where we live, but then there's all this other stuff that's been left out, where we've lived in the past, the jobs we've done in the past, the fact that we had dreams of living somewhere else. There's all these other variables which fall into our psychological capacity to explain who we are, that's just left out and lacking, not being spoken about, and which cannot be communicated in a couple of hours of conversation. So even to ourselves at times, we can feel that this ordinary self that we're trying to have a relationship with, it keeps on shifting the goalpost. And we're left then wondering where it is that we're supposed to be focusing our attention. And so this is where yoga comes back and reminds us this is the natural state of the manifest world. And where we're going to find some kind of peace is in recognizing that we're able to be aware of it. And this is where Tantra then adds an extra insight, and one which is, I suppose, more upbeat, because Tantra is telling us that that's true, that the self is the fundamental essence of who we are. But life is a play and Leela is unfolding. And so we can enjoy it, but we'll enjoy it more when we recognize that it is shifting and it can't be perfected. It can't be tied down, but it can be watched and observed. And that's where we will find most pleasure. So this ordinary sense of self is lacking. And because it's lacking, it's reaching out to find the answers. It's reaching out for more and more things. It's desiring. And it's never satisfied. But that's the very nature of it. And as long as there's a physical expression, that will be taking place. The idea of that we can anchor it down, fix it down into one definable entity, this sense of self as one definable thing, which we can then work on and fix and sculpt, that misperceives the very nature of how reality functions, how manifested reality functions. So while I was thinking about this talk, I was just thinking about how sometimes we can be sitting in our living rooms and the rain can be hitting against the glass. And it sounds quite simple. The rain is just hitting against the glass. But then we find ourselves being kind of lured into the sounds, and we hear each individual raindrop hitting against the pane of glass. And all of a sudden, something which was very simple becomes very complex, where all these individual droplets are hitting the glass, making their own tone. And the pattern becomes something enchanting, something very mystifying. And then the idea of sitting in a forest and you're maybe lying on the ground and the sun's rays are being dispersed through the leaves and the branches and scattered everywhere. So something which is simple in its essence. Lying there on the forest floor, we can imagine ourselves to just become very, very interested in how the individual rays, the rays over here are different to the rays over there, and how the color changes, and each individual ray takes on its own quality. And something which was simple becomes quite complex. And there's other analogies, we talk about the waves on the beach, and just walking down the beach. If you just go down to the beach for a quick walk, you may not necessarily think any more of it. It's just a simple occurrence, the waves lapping onto the shoreline. But if you sit there and you look at them, each wave starts to take on its own quality, and each one is individually important. And so I thought of this as being a kind of a useful way for us to reflect on our experience of the ordinary self. It's not something which can be fixed and considered simple, reduced down into an object which we can just manage. It's something which is mysterious, something which has many, many, many different variables to it. And each one of them are significant and important. And they're all making up that continuous shifting notion, concept, fictitious character, which allows us to engage in this play. The tendency is for us to want to understand it and then simplify it and have it under our control. But that in itself is what leads us to want these quick fixes and to be grasping for the quick answers. But if we can just accept that there's a mystery to the ordinary self, there's a mystery to it which we can't fully get our head around, then we open up a space to be able to just move with it. And the thing that's going to help us to do that is our awareness. It's going to allow us to accept the transitions, the movements, the shifts. It's going to be our seat as the witness, the observer, the spectator of our own lives.